do a deep dive on a cool new aspect of low code no code tech. And this week, Matthew has graciously agreed to share with us what he's been learning about the the no code side of custom components in WeWeb. And I'm sure he'll describe better than I just did how all that tech works. And really, Matthew, I would turn over the floor to you, sir. And for those who don't know you, maybe you could just give a quick, introduction of who you are and what you do, and we can then dive into the content, learn more about WeWeb.
Sure thing. Thank you very much, Ray. I suppose a bit of background on myself. I got into this low code, no code space midway through last year, probably more actually closer towards the start of last year. I was a product manager. I had to wear a lot of hats, and I discovered Zapier Make, started automating things, then wanted to put a front end on them, discovered Bubble, and then shortly after their pricing fiasco, start of last year, I discovered WeWeb, and it's been my baby since, basically. I think it opens up so many doors. Now I'm basically a freelance developer using these tools. It's what I do is under the name of Launch Leanly. It's branded as an agency. I brand it as an agency purely because none of these tools let you partner as a freelancer. You partner as an agency. So that's why it's branded as an agency, but behind the doors, it's just me. So I'll jump straight in. I shall share my screen. The way I thought it made sense to run through this is to basically go through it in terms of complexity and also lay out why I've approached components essentially and why I've gone so in depth in for the past couple of months. I'll give the usual. Can everyone see my screen all right? You have to get a thumbs up or something. Yeah, cool. So what I've been doing and what I'm in the process of doing is creating templates for WeWeb. So one of the templates I'm creating is this CRM template. And one of the nice things about components, especially when you have laid out Figma designs like I do for this, is you can turn everything into repurposable components. And if you know what you're going to use within the designs, within the templates, it's perfect. So within the project here, the first one I'll jump into is I have these data cards on the left-hand side. I know I'm going to reuse them. I know I'm going to repurpose them. And because of that, this was an example of something I wanted to turn into a component. And it's probably one of the more basic levels of components, I would say. And it's a good sort of Kickstarter to get into the different levels of functionality. So if I jump into my other project here, and this is where I have a design system where I share the components across to the template. You have the component here. Now, you can do different things with components in terms of the properties, what you expose, what triggers you set up. For this, when I approached it, I just thought, what do I need? I think with the components, it is just a case of what do you need from it to get the most value from it. And that differs in terms of the complexity. This is quite basic. All you're really doing is changing the values, right? You're changing the text, you're changing the value, and you want to change the degree of the progress bar and also the color. So all I really needed was properties. So when I was putting together, it's a case of what props, I need the text props, I need to be able to change the number, and I need to be able to change the progress bar. By the way, I know we've got degrees of sort of WeWeb users in here. If at any point in time I brush over something that might be unknown in terms of WeWeb usage, please feel free to just button, ask a question, because I'm not too sure how over the top I'm being with it. So for this component, if I go into it, you see we have the props here. So we have a header, we have a subheader, we have a total, which is bound here. We've got a trend icon, and we have a progress bar fill color. And so this is all dynamically changing. So if I wanted to change this to customers, it populates it as you would imagine. And then likewise, if I wanted to change the progress bar color, I could change it to blue. So it's all well and good. And then we have the progress bar here, which just adjusts as you need it to. Now, setting this up, in terms of managing the states, so for instance, for the trend here, if I were to go back and I change the trend icon to up or down, managing these different states and properties within the components themselves, it depends on how complex you get. So in the example of this, one of the nice things about WeWeb is you have custom state properties. So here for the trend, you have a state selector and you can define custom states. And because this doesn't really have many states, it only has 3 states, I like to use this because it's relatively simple and it makes it very manageable as opposed to what I'll show in a second. So here I just have uptrend and downtrend, and I define whatever the conditions might be. So in this case, if the trend property is up, this is true. And so then it changes the color to green, changes the icon appropriately. And if it's a downtrend, sets a red color and sets the appropriate icon. And then the one other thing I needed here was if this is off, I obviously don't want to display the icon. So if I just flip back to it, I have conditional rendering set up so that across all of the states, their rendering is based on that show trend icon. So for something that's relatively simple and doesn't have many states, that's how I like to manage it. I will show you just for context how it can get more complex when you need to manage many different states. So I have a hidden button here. And this is a very complex button. It has a bunch of different properties, bunch of different possible states. And this is by no means the best way to do this. I show this just for the more advanced WeWeb users out there. The best way I've found to manage a very complex property at the minute is through their formulas. So if I set this button to be visible, just to show, this is a background color. And if I was to change it to a different type, so I change it to resting, I have to manage the background colors, the borders, everything else. And the best way to do that I found is these formulas. And so I might have, let's say, the primary border color. And for this, I have a bunch of different cases set up to return whatever the color might be, whatever the styling might be. It can get very complex. I would say this is probably one of the most complex components you can have in terms of the styling, with just how many different button variants you can have. But unfortunately, I say unfortunately because it's a bit of a nuisance to manage. But in terms of WeWeb and managing complex styling via properties, this is the best way I found to do it. It's via the formulas. And so then that way, on the button itself, take the border, for example, inside of the border, I just have that bound. So I say if disabled is true, I return the formula for the disabled border color. And likewise for primary border color. And I do that in a bunch of different places for the background and wherever styling is required to be bound. So yes, so that's one of the more basic components I would say, because the only thing I needed to do with this component was expose properties and make those properties editable wherever I needed to. And just to show it in a practical context, if I go back to the template where I'm using this, what that then enabled me to do is to have a single list here. So in WeWeb, you can have a single div, and I can then bind items, which just dynamically creates whatever you have inside of that div. So here I have items, and this might look a bit convoluted, but essentially all it's doing is I've got 3 objects. I've got an array of 3 objects, and so then it creates 3 of these components, and I've passed in data that I can then bind to the component I've created. So if I was to click on the data card component for the header, I've got the title bound. For the total, I've got the total bound. And then for the progress bar fill color, I have, whatever fill color is. And then likewise, for the actual progress value, which dictates where the bar is, I've got another value bound. On that, I do want to raise one more thing that is kind of nuanced with these components, is that I haven't found a good way to nest components and have it be very, I wouldn't say manageable, but just have it not be a nuisance. So this progress bar is a component of itself, and it takes properties. So it has a fill color and it has a progress value. Now these 2 properties are duplicates of the properties I have on this data card component. And I say it's a nuisance because if you have nested properties, sorry, you have nested components, and those nested components have properties of their own that you want to pass values into, I found that the only way to do that is to manually duplicate the properties that you require for the child components on the parent components. And if you have very complex nested components, it means you have to duplicate a lot of the properties of that child component into the parent. It can become a nuisance. I say that for context. I haven't found a good way to work with it at the moment. However, if you get into the more complex components, it's just something to be aware of. So yes, that's the first one I plan to go through. Just to double check, is there any questions?
Yeah, I've just got a question there, Matthew. I just started looking at components last week. They're pretty cool. Can save you a lot of time, eh? I was just trying to work out, is there a difference on the workflows? Like when would you use a workflow as opposed to like the actual workflow on after the settings tab?
So if you were
If you could just open up the editor again, you know how there's
yeah
the workflows down the bottom. So and down here,
Yeah.
yeah, workflows there. But if you go up the top, and yeah,
Well, like
and go into
people.
there, there's also
Yeah,
workflows.
sure.
Is
That's a good
there?
question. So let me just check what I had here. It might be a good example. No, so the best way to do that is, let me see, actually, I'll show you an example of something I could. Actually, we'll use this one. So I've got a tooltip component that I use. And so when I hover over
Mhm,
this, it shows the tooltip. And the nice
sure,
thing about these is that if I find it, so this component, I have a workflow here, and I've got hide tooltip and show tooltip. So the difference
sure.
between the workflows in here and the workflow on kind of just the basic elements is you can expose it to the outside world. So for this component, I have this show tooltip workflow. But at the top here, what the components have versus what the elements don't have is these two options. So you can allow execution from the outside and execution from the drop zone. And so the nice thing about that is I can put anything anywhere and I can then execute that workflow. So for example, on this text, I have a workflow where on mouse enter, I execute a component action. And so I can then trigger the workflow of that component.
Oh, yeah.
And so, yeah, because you can expose it to the outside world, it allows you to repurpose it basically. I hope that makes
Mm,
sense.
cool.
Do you mind showing an example of the drop down, or sorry, drop zone? Um, I was confused about that.
Yes. So let's see. Let's use this one or sorry, I'm just trying to think which would be a good example for this.
Sure, yeah, and specifically, like I think they just released like inside your drop zone, you can have this instance, and I was also kind of confused on what that is versus just a
You know what?
normal kind of drop zone.
Let's do one live now just to show. So if I
I
just
love
drag a
live.
div onto the page and we just say, so we have a basic flex box here. And if I was to click out of this, you only see the example. You can't really do anything with it. If we were a user, we can't, well, there's no props, obviously, and we can't do anything with this. However, if we add a drop zone, we click out, we now as a user have this drop zone. And so actually I have to refresh. This is one of the nuances of the WeWeb at the minute, where if you add a drop zone to be able to use it, you then have to refresh the page. So if I refresh, if I use this drop zone as just a standard user of the component, I can now add things into that drop zone. And so then for the ID, I think they expose this to actually everything at the moment, this instance, if I'm not mistaken. But from what I've found, there isn't really a perfect use case for this at the moment, because it's basically just, and I'm by no means technical enough to word this perfectly, but it's just the instance in the HTML per se. And so it exposes a bunch of different things about the element in a HTML context. I'm trying to think, I remembered one use case for this. The one use case I found for this, if you want to access the actual ID of the element in the HTML. But apart from that, I haven't found a good use case for it.
Got it. Okay. Yeah,
Does
I
that
was
answer your question, Anthony, about the drop
to
zone?
totally, totally. Yeah, I was like, what's a good use case for this instance? So for instance, when you do a workflow and you're able to expose something to the drop zone, um, let's say your workflow changes the text,
Mhm.
dynamically, based on a workflow parameter. Is that able then to? I'm assuming that's able then to refresh or update that text inside of the drop zone because you exposed it.
Exactly. So if I switch back to here, it might be a good example with this table. So for this table, it's I have a table container. This is a component. And then inside of the rows, I have table rows. And so this, what these are, because I can't actually click on them, is items is a drop zone, header is a drop zone, and then pagination is a drop zone. And so what I've done is, if I've got one here, yes, I do. Yes. So because I've exposed within inside of this table container, I have workflows and I've exposed those workflows to the drop zone. For example, for the table row, within its workflows, I can then utilize whatever the workflows might be of the container. So I know that one of the example, I haven't got it set up here, but one of the possible things I can do with this row is I can select an item. So if I wanted to select the row in the table, on click, I could then have a workflow set up that would then execute a drop zone workflow of its parent. So in this case, the table container. And I could do something with that, then add it to kind of the overall tracking of whatever items are selected in the table. I hope that makes sense.
Got it. Yeah, that totally makes sense. Thank you. Yeah, I can see how this can get really complex really fast.
It can, which is why I've got them nested here. This was, knowing what I know now, I'm honestly might not, I think it's best if you can to not nest components because it can get very convoluted and WeWeb haven't sort of perfected the component process and you can kind of get yourself in a hole depending on your niche use case. And so if I was to redo this, to be honest with you, I wouldn't have a set table container and then have drop zones where I put different components inside of it. I would probably just have a single table component and build it all within that, at least with where the components are at right now.
Smart.
Cool, right, so if I jump back,
What does a drop zone do, Matthew?
it allows you to put things in it as a user. So for this component, I have a drop zone. And if this drop zone wasn't here, I'll just put it back in just to show. So we've removed the drop zone. And without a drop zone, there's nothing you can do with the component if you haven't got any props inside of it. So if you're just a standard user, you can't really do anything with it. You can't edit it in any way. However, if you were to add a drop zone into the component, and I might have to refresh. Yes, I'll have to refresh again.
Just for clarification, this is not like a user of the app. This is like a builder user, right?
Exactly. Yeah, sorry. That's a good clarification. Thank you. Yeah. And so then once you have a drop zone inside of the component, that then lets you interact with it more effectively as a builder. So I can then put things inside of the drop zone. And when you're actually building the component, you can, if you're aware that you want users to, or builder users to be able to put things inside of that drop zone, you can then build functionality around that, like Anthony was mentioning, where you could have specific workflows that only allow execution from the drop zone.
So this is to put like containers and stuff inside of it when you're not actually editing the component. Is that right?
It's more if you plan on, I would say it's more if you plan on either in the future giving a different WeWeb builder access to this, or you yourself plan to use it for multiple things. If you had a component, let's say take this data card, for example, because I knew this was never going to be changed in any way, shape, or form. I knew it was always going to have a title. I knew it was always going to have this number. I knew it was always just going to be a progress bar. I didn't add any drop zones because I knew it wouldn't be edited in from a content perspective. However, if I knew that either someone else, another builder on my project, was going to use this in the future, or I knew that I'd have to repurpose it in some way, shape, or form because there might be a completely different set of content on a different page when using this, then I could add a drop zone and I could then put different things inside of it. So in the case of, if I switch back to here, in the case of this table, for example, I know on different pages, I'll have tables that will be consistent across the pages. I know I'm going to have multiple tables, but the actual content of that table, the rows inside of it, will differ from page to page. And so because of that, in my case, it made sense to have a drop zone because that way from a page to page basis, I could put things into the table myself as opposed to, creating multiple table components.
Cool.
It makes your components customizable without editing the component itself. You're just putting different things in it.
Exactly. If you've used WeWeb's data grid component or their element, their native one, a good example is what they do with the cells in the data grid, where they let you just drag and drop things into the cells. That's the exact same thing as a drop zone. So if you were, if you wanted to recreate their data grid, you would want to add a cell. So you want to add a drop zone where each cell would be, because if someone was then using the component, it would allow them to utilize it in the exact same way.
These components that you're making, did you code these from scratch and import them as a Vue component, or you're just using the pre-existing WeWeb stuff?
This is all WeWeb. Nothing is in Vue.
Got it. Thanks.
And then would it be right to think that the individual components, like the row stuff, right, that you put inside the drop zone, right, or the cells or what have you, they have access, right, to information from that parent container in a way that another component that's sitting outside that table container would not have access to?
Sorry, Ray, could you say that one more time?
Yeah, sure. So like this kind of gets like the issue of having table row content, right?
Mhm.
So like the table row would then get to be populated based on information coming from, say, the table container, so that your row or whatever you put inside the drop zone would be aware or be able to be fed or be informed by data coming from or workflows coming from the container that's surrounding it in a way that something that's like just a peer to it, right? Another component wouldn't have access to that because it wouldn't be in its tree.
Right. Exactly. And that's a perfect use case. I know I tried to do that initially on this table container, where I tried to have it so you could bind data to the table container and that would then get passed to the rows. This kind of falls into the nuance of the components at the minute, and maybe it's just me specifically trying to set it up. I couldn't find a good way to do it that allowed for flexibility and allowed it to pass through multiple layers of child components.
Yeah.
And so I had to, in this case specifically, I had to set it up so that the rows, this items section is a drop zone. And so then I have manually bound items here. Is this perfect? No, but you could absolutely do that. I haven't just in this specific use case, but you could absolutely do that. But you can then, just to relay onto your point, you can then allow components outside of, let's say in this case, the table container, to adjust things inside of that component. So for example, here, these selectors, this is a component. Let me just check, it's in the header, I think. Yeah, so we have selector here, and this is what these are. These are the selectors. And obviously these have access to the components that all sit within inside of here. And so if I was to click draft, there's none there actually, no, but if I click scheduled, it then filters everything in table row specifically, and then likewise for paid. So it's 100%. It is basically just lets you, cater for multiple things inside of the broader components.
Very cool.
Hey, Matthew, is it? Oh,
Sorry, go on.
Oh, I was just going to say, is there, there's no way to work with like pop-ups in components, is there? Or there is?
There is. So I'm just trying to think. Actually, if I switch back to here, so I haven't. This isn't laid out in the nicest way possible. This design system I have I've set up for the most basic functionality here. So if I click this, you get this ugly thing. However, if just to show you that it's inside of here, and if I switch back to the template where I'm using it, a nicer way to put this is I have a pop-up for when I click on one of these rows. So if I click this, you get this pop-up. So you absolutely can. What I'm doing with something like this pop-up, is, I mean, it looks convoluted, but the most basic way I could describe it is whenever you click on it, all it's really doing is changing variables that control its visibility. And when it's set to be visible, I have just some kind of positioning of it, i.e. it goes from 10 pixels down to its regular 0 pixel position, and I change the opacity just so it transitions in nicely. And then I use a bit of JavaScript when it's mounted to set up an event listener. That all this does is it watches for clicks outside of the element, and then it updates a variable. So there's a variable that controls its display. This watches for clicks outside of the element. When it detects that, it sets the display variable to false. And so then I just hide the pop-up. So it's all very much possible, yeah.
Cool.
I'm happy to see this. This is great. This is so cool. Is there a way you can speak to like, triggers a little bit as well? If you've used them in,
Yes,
examples.
thank you. I think that moves on nicely to the second one I had. So one of the most basic things you can get in WeWeb, and this is one of the nice things about components, is it just allows you to add flexibility to I suppose really to what the basic elements are. So this is just a text input. However, for the use case in this template I was building on something like the sign up page, I needed a bit more advanced functionality, let's say around the input itself. So I needed some kind of validation because you need to input at least 2 words. I needed some way of knowing when the user is ready to progress because I had to disable the sign up button. And I needed some kind of success state. So this was 2 words, I think. I might change it to 3 words in the back end. There's 2 words, yeah. And I need some way to know when to show a success state. So I needed a component around this basically. And because of the functionality I needed here, in the sense of I needed to know when this could be clicked, and when to show the success state, I needed to expose certain pieces of data. So I needed to expose when the user could progress, i.e. when this was successfully input. And then for a trigger, I didn't need it necessarily here, but I'll show you what I've got set up here in a second. You could set up a trigger when the user has entered something successfully. So for this text input, I have properties that control different things here. So you've got that's supposed to header text. So you can say prompt text and it changes the text at the top. I won't change the placeholder, but it does just the same thing. I've got an icon if I want to include an icon, and there's some hint text I can include at the bottom. Where I guess the magic happens with this is in the settings tab. So I've got validation set up. So let's say, for example, right now I've got it set to a minimum number of characters. I've only got it set to 5. But so then that way, if I was to put in 2 characters, I have check error here, which just basically checks if this triggers a workflow of the component to check if the user has met that validation I input in the settings tab. And so if I press this, I need to input at least 5 characters. And so then when I input 5 characters, it changes. And then likewise, if I was to change this I can put this to min number of 0, but let's say you have to input at least 2 words. If I was to now check this, I have to input at least 2 words. And so then when I've input 2 words, I get a success state. So this is nice where you can get, when you need specific functionality around even the most basic elements, you can get creative with how you use the components. And all this is doing on the back end for context is I have workflow set up on change of the input itself. So this is actually a good example of where the component workflows come in handy and how you can access them from things inside. So this is a text input component, and then the actual input itself is one of the elements inside of it. And so on the component itself, I have a workflow, which is called check input. And this checks whatever's been entered into that text input, and it runs it through whatever validation has been set up within those settings. So where you put in min number of words, min number of characters, whatever it is, it checks to see if those requirements have been met, and then does certain things depending on if it has or not. However, because it's a component workflow, I needed to trigger it somehow. And so then that way, because I've exposed it to the outside world and to drop zones, that way on the actual input itself, I can have a workflow where it says on change, execute the workflow of check input. So that's an example of that. To answer your question specifically, Anthony, so what I did for the variables and the triggers on this is this has a inputs entered success variable, and this is exposed to the outside world. And so if I go to variables, it's true at the minute. However, so we needed at least 2 words. If I get rid of this, it's now false. And if I input 2 words again, it's now true. And so I can set up logic around that to the outside world. And so that's what I'm doing here, where all 3 of these inputs on this page have that variable. And so once, in this case, all 3 of those inputs have that exposed success variable set to true, I know the user can progress. And so that's a use case where you could use that for the exposed variables. And then for the trigger specifically, I haven't got anything on this page, but maybe if you saw when I was just inputting things here, there was a pop-up at the bottom. So if I get rid of this, you see there's a input entered successfully. And so this is a trigger or an event, sorry. So if I just click back to it one last time, I have a trigger here. So I've got enter pressed. The reason I have this is just because I might need functionality around it in the future when a user presses enter. But the one I'm using for the pop-up in the bottom right-hand corner is inputs entered successfully. And so in the workflow where I'm checking the input, I'm performing checks to see if the users entered the correct things. And then if they have, I trigger the event. So here I'm triggering event, inputs entered successfully. This only gets triggered when they have input whatever your requirements are. And so because I'm triggering this event, I can then have a workflow set up on the component itself, which I do here, where once that event is triggered, I can trigger something else. And I have a toast component where I show a toast, which is why if you just watch the bottom right-hand corner, whenever I meet the criteria, I can then trigger that. Yeah.
It's so
So that's
beautiful.
these are so powerful. Honestly, it's only really I've been gone in depth with it for the past 2 months or so. I've really realized, because this has been in there since November, and I've only really now realized just how powerful it all is. So yes, so that's how I guess the variables and events can work the best as I see it. I think depending on the level of complexity of components you're creating, and it also depends on if you're building for yourself or building for other builders in the future. I think the best way to approach it, at least if you're building for other builders, is how would WeWeb approach it? And I think they would always just try and give the most flexibility possible in terms of what variables should I expose in order for a user to build around it? What triggers and events do I need to expose in order for a user to build around it in the most flexible way? And I found that's the best way to approach it. I just think, what would the WeWeb folk do if they were building a component? And I just build it in the same way if I need flexibility.
For this text input, I noticed one of your variables was maximum character count. Were you actually able to restrict the end user from typing more characters, or was it just a validation?
It's a good question. Let me see. Let's see. I made this a while back. I can't remember what I did with it. Let's find out. One, two, three, four, five. Oh, it's just a validation thing.
Okay.
Although you could restrict it because what you can do with the inputs is you can control the initial value. And I haven't got anything set up, but if you really wanted to, you could set up some kind of logic so that when the user tries to input more than 5 characters, you could adjust whatever the initial value is bound to and take away the most recent character they input. So if you wanted to restrict it, you could restrict it.
Okay, interesting.
So,
Cool.
question, would you consider Vue or like no code components? I think obviously I know the answer, but
It's almost like you know what the next component is, Anthony. You've transitioned it so nicely even into this one, and it also transitions nicely into the next one. So for the next one, I have this bar chart. And what this is it's actually a HTML element. So what I've done for this is I have a canvas ID with height, and then have I got it set up here? Yes, I do. On mounted of this, I run JavaScript. And what all this does essentially is it uses chart.js to render a chart. However, the nice thing about it is that in the rendering process, i.e. the line color it uses, and the data values it uses and the labels it uses properties from this component. So it uses the labels and it uses the values and it uses this color. So for example, if I was to change this to green, and let's say this selector is set up to change the labels and the values. If I change this to week and I then refresh, you can see it changes the values and the labels that was passed in, and it changes the props. So this is very cool. This kind of opened my eyes in many ways, because I know within the Statechange community, we've been messing around in WeWeb to render things using this HTML element. And this gives you a huge amount of flexibility, because you can then, whenever you do something like this, where you render it using custom JavaScript, if you pass in props and you can get it to work in the same way as a coded component, I mean, there's probably a lot of cases where it makes sense to do this as opposed to going down the coded component route. One thing I will mention with this, and I didn't extensively try and get it to work, although I did try and do it in passing yesterday, is that I couldn't find a good way to manage the life cycle of the component. So if you're using Chart.js natively within WeWeb, whenever you change a property, like you change the value, you change the labels, colors, whatever, it dynamically updates. So if I was to change month here and I won't change the color, but if I was to change the color again, I need to refresh to get it to change those things. And I was trying to find a way to actually destroy the component and reinitialize it when the props change. I couldn't find a way to do that. I didn't extensively look. Well, I couldn't find a good way to do it, which is where something like a custom coded component, I mean, really, if you're going down the route of using charts, is probably the best way to go. But if you're fine with, in a use case like this, with something not necessarily dynamically updating perfectly as and when you need it to, I don't think it's the worst way to go.
Ray, I know that we spent some time destroying graphs for fun. Um, is that something that could work here, like throwing some JavaScript in to destroy the graph and
Yeah, you can
drawing it?
destroy the graph or just update it through injection. But I think that Matthew used the key word here, which is lifecycle, which is WeWeb is built on top of Vue.js, right? So it's managing the lifecycle of its components through the Vue runtime. And when you bring in something external like Chart.js has no idea what's going on with the Vue runtime. The advantage of using like a Vue chart component, like a Vue Chart.js component, is that basically it just sort of comes with the wrapper to align those two runtimes. It's kind of a lot of the service that you're getting out of it. And so if you're not using that, or if you're not using the custom component route, what you're doing is you're adding in a bit more JavaScript to manage that synchronization of life cycles, so that you can have a listener that, hey, this variable changed in WeWeb land, so now I'm going to come around and execute this workflow or execute this action that's going to then update my chart, just to keep the two of those things in sync. You wind up bringing code to the party either way, right? The question is whether you're bringing some Vue code to the party, and that's sort of the custom component route, or whether you're bringing code that we're kind of, putting in through the keyhole of the workflows, right, in order to be conveying our intent that way. But you can get very high level control, using both those approaches. I'm working right now with a client who you and I both know, Anthony, who's implemented that kind of high level of control with charts, using high charts, and is in WeWeb, right, and is controlling it through workflows and creating an experience that looks like it's just another custom component. Because at the end of the day, both approaches are getting you to the same place, right? It's a question of which approach is going to be easier for you and feels more low codey in terms of not having to go shift around more of your mental model of how you're approaching the build. So I certainly, when I thought the way Matthew described it in terms of managing life cycles is a really good way to be thinking about bringing external code in. And when you care about that life cycle being more dynamic, you're going to be owning a bit more work, either the component route of using custom component or the workflow route, in order, and the job can be thought of as just synchronizing the life cycles of those two two worlds, right? The chart.js world and the view world that's in WeWeb.
Cool.
That
Thank
help a
you,
little
Ray.
bit?
No, I've learned from that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, we've got about 18 minutes left. One final thing I had to run through, I guess, is the most practical example of this, and it somewhat relates to the custom component side as well, no code versus using something coded, is I needed this emoji picker, which is kind of where the whole component journey started off for me from a complex perspective.
Cyrus, yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you, Ray, by the way. You're a big help in this. And yeah, initially I thought I was going to code this because it just seemed like something that needed coded. However, when I thought about it, just knowing what I know about the node code components, I thought this is probably can be built within a node code component, and it absolutely could. Because if I just click out of this and go into here, this is a node code component. The one thing I will say is that it's not all sunshine and rainbows, although I suppose it's a trade-off. So one of the problems I found with this, and this is more WeWeb specific, is it can become tricky to target certain things inside of the components. So for example, one piece of functionality I've been going back and forth to trying to get working is clicking on one of these categories at the bottom and having it scroll to the correct section. So if I was to click this, you can see it doesn't scroll perfectly to that section. And it should be as straightforward as having some JavaScript that targets the div with its ID or something and scrolls to it. But because of how WeWeb set up, they create divs that you can't see and things of that nature. I found it very difficult to target the correct div, and it's been an absolute nightmare to the point where I've just gone down the route of hard coding how much it scrolls down. I haven't got it perfected. If this was a coded component, it would be very straightforward to target the div using its ID and scroll. However, there's a trade-off there where, yes, that would be easier, but building the entire thing net, in my opinion, wouldn't be easier. So it's just something I'm happy to live with, basically, and figure out in some way, shape, or form. But everything else works as you would expect. I just realized I haven't actually, so this component itself, I've built in a different project and I've passed this project. So give me 1 second. I would just switch to the project where I have this, just so I can actually show what I'm doing with it.
Also, just say for anyone who's starting to bring in some JavaScript stuff to WeWeb, that double, triple wrapping of components. I think actually, maybe Daniel, you and I were talking about that earlier today.
Yeah, last night.
Right, last night, yeah. It's a thing. It's a confusing thing. So people who are used to, hey, I know how to work a website and I can make these modifications. I did this in Webflow. Why isn't it working in WeWeb? Usually has a lot to do with that kind of extra laminating, as I think of it, on these components and exactly at which level you have the ID and how you need to traverse to get to the thing you really mean to manage. And using dev tools really helps with that because you can sort of see, oh, wait, it's actually not this guy, it's its grandson, and they move on.
So if I jump back in, so this is where I have the component itself. And I suppose this kind of brings it full circle because with this component, I'm doing everything that we discussed. So I'm exposing variables, I'm obviously exposing props, I'm exposing workflows, and I've tried to build it in a way that anyone could use it because I plan to put it on the marketplace whenever WeWeb gets that launched. And so I needed a way to, when I was building it, I thought, okay, so if the WeWeb guys and girls were building an emoji picker, what would they want? Well, they'll need some way to have a user be able to display it. So I needed to allow for a workflow that triggers its display, which is what happens when you click this. I needed a way to know when it's visible. I needed a way to know which emoji has been picked. So if you were to click it or you were to click an emoji, you need something to do with that, or you need to be able to do something with it. So for example, on the component itself, I have a trigger set up called emoji selected. And what I do with that is I pass in the emoji and I pass in the value. So they call them, different things like smiley face or whatever the text value is. And so whenever you click one of these, I trigger the event for emoji selected. And because I'm triggering that event, I can then have different workflows set up. So whenever emoji selected is triggered, I change the variable value for this form input, and I can then do something where I basically add in the emoji. So if I was to click one of these, it then gets added there, and then all this selected is it's just watching whatever is selected, which is one of the variables. So if I go to the debugger here, I need to clear, there you go, for the elements. For this component, I'm exposing a variable called emoji selected. And in the same way, I'm triggering the emoji selected event. In that same workflow that triggers it, all I do is change this variable in the component emoji selected to whatever they've picked. And I also expose this variable. Does both achieve the same thing in the sense of, well, you're exposing a variable that exposes this data and you're triggering an event that also exposes that data? Are they duplicates of each other in that sense? I suppose they are, but I think it's good to just provide freedom and flexibility, because I've learned using the WeWeb elements that the more freedom and flexibility there is, even if it seems nuanced, the better. So that's why I've done that. And then another example of this, I haven't got it set up, but I can just show what the thought process was. If I go back into it, is I have, so for the workflows, I have something called update recently used emojis, and this allows execution from anywhere. And so in the example of this, there's a recent area. And so maybe when you're using this, you want a user's 10 most recent emojis to be saved. But I have no way, when you're building components, you can't save the variables to local storage or anything of that nature. They don't persist. So on refresh, you'll lose whatever the recent are. But as someone building an app, you might want to keep track of users' recent emoji usage throughout whatever history. And so you could save that in whatever way, shape, or form you want to. And then you could call this update recent used emojis workflow from anywhere. So maybe on page load, on mount of the component, whatever it is, you could manually pass in whatever emojis you want, which will then update this. So again, it just allows for flexibility and freedom, setting up the workflows and triggers to enable that, which is, yeah, essentially what I've done. And then, I mean, I found with a lot of these components, once you figure out a certain piece of functionality, you then can repurpose it for other components. So in the same way for the pop-up earlier, I was setting a click out listener. I do the exact same for this. I just have a listener set up that targets the emoji picker. And then when it detects a click outside of it, it updates the variable that controls its visibility. Yeah, I think, I mean, that's about it. And then for the properties, just standard styling properties. There's a light mode and a dark mode. And all I'm doing with this is inside of here, I have formulas like I showed with the button, where depending on whatever prop is selected, I have a formula that changes the background color, the outline, whatever it might be. And so then on the thing itself, for the styling, I have the background color, border color, whatever it is, bound to that formula.
You sure where that binding is?
Sure thing. Hmm. Where have I got it set up now? Did I have it here? Sorry, right. I definitely have it somewhere.
Okay.
Oh, there it is. I think it's on the outer. There we go. Okay, yeah. And then I've just got it bound to something like that for the formula. And then same thing for the borders.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much. So you're just showing how those are dynamic. It was cool to see the formulas and sort of see how the formulas link all the way from the inputs to the way they're bound into the properties. That's very cool.
So yeah, I mean that's everything I thought would be good to run through. I don't know if anyone has any questions or anything they want to discuss.
That's superb. All right, let's open up the floor a bit. If I could put special attention for Peter and Preston and the other Daniel for a question you had. Daniel, in particular, I saw that you had a few things you've thrown into your comments. I didn't know whether you felt like those questions got answered okay for you. See you, Jordan, and have a good night, man.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. Yeah, it pretty much made sense. The more people kept asking Matthew questions. Yeah, I guess the terminology, like in terms of the callbacks, like the way that things are interacting between nested components with the parent component.
We talk about that for a minute, like the flow of information and action between like what goes into a drop zone for a child versus what you have out in the in the parent container thing. Matthew?
Yes. Let me see if I got something to show here. I'm trying to think where I've got a good drop zone, because one of the things with drop zones is you can pass in data. Actually, I'll show you where I can show this. Sorry, I'm just going to pause for a second, just switch back to the other project. So when you are
Thanks,
using the
Mike.
drop zones, there is a property that WeWeb gives you access to called drop zone data. And so why that can be handy is because if you have a prop, let's say you have two components, one is an outer parent component and the other is a child component. If you pass in a prop to that parent component and you want that data to be exposed to the child component, and let's say the child component sits inside of a drop zone or whatever it might be, you need to manually bind drop zone data to the data you want to pass in, which I will show in a second. I think this would be a good example. I got a drop zone here. Yes, I do. I got data. There we go. Okay. So inside of this component, I have a drop zone. And one of the props that is part of this component is item data. So you can bind data here, and this is then supposed to be passed in to whatever you put into the drop zone, because there's a drop zone here that someone could put something in. And what I've done here is I put in a component. Now, in this component itself, I have bound properties. So I'm binding the image to image, and I'm binding text to whatever text I passed in here in item data. However, natively, this wouldn't be possible. So this dropzone.data. Whatever it is, it wouldn't be possible to just manually pick up that data. So what I had to do is on the drop zone itself, whenever I was creating it, I had to bind drop zone data. And this is just a thing natively within WeWeb. I haven't created this. This is always a part of the drop zones. I had to bind that item data prop to the drop zone so that that data would then be accessible for whatever the user puts in the drop zone. Sorry, Daniel, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it definitely does. I really appreciate this, Matthew, especially because some of the like what you've been showing and discussing today, I don't think there's a lot of education on it as far as it goes from WeWeb Academy and their YouTube. I think the best value I've found is directly from the live streams where I've seen examples of using components with drop zones like this. So thank you so much, Matthew.
No worries. And sorry, I missed your question in the chat, by the way. I haven't been able to see it for the past hour or so.
Can I check in with Peter or Preston? Any questions from you gents? Because we haven't. I just want to make sure that if you've got something coming in, that we're able to be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, let me see if I can share my. Oh, there it is. My camera. Well, can't see it. Anyway,
Okay. Yeah.
oh, there it is. I thought it was great. I think the main thing I'm taking away is kind of when philosophically, you know, when do you jump to creating a component for that?
Yeah.
And when do you create that drop zone for that? I think those lines are probably different for every different person. Depends if you're working with a team, working with just by yourself. But yeah, I'm seeing a lot of things that I'm doing with, case statements and if statements where, hey, I probably just need to be, structure this a little bit more into a component or something, and, have these different elements. So no question per se, but yeah, you definitely expanded my thinking on how to approach some of these design elements. Yeah.
It is a very tricky one though. I mean, it's all well and good to have the components and they're very powerful, but I have found, I mean, in the example I gave, I have a template, it has a Figma file, it's all very much laid out. But if you're building something that could chop and change, building components could hurt you in terms of just opportunity cost, because it does take longer to create the components as opposed to just building a one-off element, whatever it might be. And so there's definitely a decision-making process to it. It always isn't, it's not always, ideal. And it very much it does depend on who you're building it for, because if you're building it for yourself and no one else is going to use it, it probably makes sense just go down the route, if you are building a component, to just build it for your specific use case, as opposed to, including a bunch of different variables and workflows to give freedom of flexibility, because it's a double-edged sword, I guess, where you could spend more time trying to make it flexible. And then not only could you spend more time doing it, you might actually just not make it as functional and useful for you, because you tried to make it more flexible as opposed to just building it for your specific use case.
Very cool.
Just because you mentioned me, but nothing to add or ask on my end. I know we're at time, but it's really great info, Matthew. So I really appreciate you spending the time to do this. So it's been helpful.
No worries at all. I'm glad it was insightful.
And I think that is definitely the minimum word for it. Thank you so much, Matthew. I've learned a tremendous amount from you today. I think we're all better suited to get into stuff. And I thought Daniel's point about there's just not that much documentation on this. You just go to look to learn about it, and there's a surface level, but that's where your deep dive, I think, has really broadened our horizons and deepened our knowledge much faster than I think any other resource out there. So kudos to you, man. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you guys found it helpful, insightful, and I mean, WeWeb in itself and these components are so powerful, but it comes with a lot of trial and error, put it that way. That's been my learning process, unfortunately. So there definitely could be a lot more documentation on it.
Good. All right. Thank you so much. We'll be doing office hours all the rest of the week, and I'll get the video up later today so we can be relearning the bits that will help us all make progress. Thank you so much, Matthew, and we'll be seeing you again soon. Bye.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks.